got an image here where I want to try to do some skin tone matching. This image, very obviously, her face is much brighter and a little cooler than her arms, which are much darker, tan, a little more orangey yellow. Now, how do we match these skin tones? Well, first thing we want to do is realize that colors are essentially made up of two different things. One is luminosity, or brightness and darkness, and two is color. And color consists of two other things. It consists of hue, which is the actual color, like meaning yellow, orange, blue, that kind of thing. And then saturation, which is the amount of that corresponding color. So, if I want to look at this, I want to select the her arms, because I want to work just on her arms. So what we'll do is go into here, and I'm working on the quick selection tool. Let's increase the size of my brush. Let's pick her arm, does a pretty decent job. Pick her other arm, again, does a pretty decent job. Let's zoom in. We missed some of her hand here, but I can choose how much of this, you can refine this, and this is really a selection exercise. But I'll go in, and I'm just going to quickly pick through and add her fingers in, and then it added some of these balls from her bracelet. So I'm going to press the Alt or Option key and just brush over what I don't want. Okay, and it's good enough for this example. So I'll press Command or Control 0 to fit to my screen. Now, I know that I want to affect just her arms, and I want to do that with two separate things, with luminosity and with color. And in this example, I'm going to use a levels adjustment layer, okay? But what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a luminosity level adjustment layer and a color level adjustment layer. So I'm going to put those two in a group, okay? So let's call this skin fix or something, whatever you want to call it. Fix, not fin, okay? And I'm going to add a mask, and with her arms selected, what you'll notice is it will create a black mask with her arms available. Okay? So now everything I put in this group will be affected by this mask. So let's look at something that I want to do. I want to apply something we call a perceptual black and white. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at this. I've got some test strips here, a little sidetrack for you. I've got two spectrums. I've got spectrum 1 and spectrum 2. They're exactly the same thing. They go from red, orange, yellow, all the way through back to red. I've got spectrum 1 selected. What I'm going to do is I'm going to simply go into Image Adjustments, and I'm going to desaturate this image. Okay? And what you'll see is it creates a solid gray block because it takes the saturation of all those colors and reduces it to 0. Okay? Now, what happens? Well, it doesn't look anything like we'd expect because it takes away all the level of the color. Now, if you look at this bar up top, the spectrum 2, we've got a blue, the cyan, the yellow is obviously quite bright, the blue is quite dark, the reds are somewhere in between the yellows and the blues, okay? So if I were to actually make that black and white, I would expect to see that the blues would be darker and things like that. So selecting this group, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a solid color adjustment layer, okay? And with this selected, what I tend to do is I type in 80, 80, 80, which is middle gray. But you don't have to stick to middle gray. You can drag this on the left-hand side anywhere between white and black. Doesn't really matter. And then change this to a color blend mode, okay? So let's go to color blend mode. Now, if you look at that top spectrum, that makes sense because now the yellows are quite bright. The blues are quite dark. The oranges and reds and magentas are somewhere in between. The cyans are bright. The greens are darker than the cyans, so it makes sense. This is a perceptual black and white. Okay, so let's shut off these test strips because we're done with that for now. Now, I want to work inside this skin fix group. I'm going to create 2 level adjustment layers, okay? So we'll create a level adjustment layer and a level adjustment layer. I have a tendency to throw out these masks since I'm not using them. I just think they confuse me, or they can, so I get rid of them, and that way I know I'm working off the group mask. If you need one, you can always create one later. So we'll go to this one, and I'm going to call this level 1. Let's call this luminosity, or lumen, okay? And then I'm going to change the blend mode to luminosity, okay? And the second one I'm going to call color. And not entirely coincidentally, I'm going to change this blend mode to color, okay? So now if I go to this luminosity blend mode, or this luminosity levels, and we look at this, and anything I do, okay, if I pull this left, you'll see it adds brightness, okay, so it takes the whites and makes the white information brighter. And here I want to add the midtones. I want to add some brightness to the midtones, and let's pull these a little bit brighter. I want to try to match her arms with her face, okay? So now I can add a little bit of contrast by pulling the blacks to the right. We'll make them darker, okay? Now, underneath here is the output levels. I can also go in and I can change the output levels of our blacks, make the blacks brighter. In this case, I don't want to. Or I can make the whites, the brights, darker. In this case, I don't want to. Okay? So that luminance levels adjustment layer does a pretty decent job. Now, if I shut off this color fill, that perceptual black and white, it does a pretty decent job. You can see it matches fairly well without changing a whole lot of colors. Now, I do want to make a modification to the colors because a couple different ways you can check. One is with this eyedropper. If I hover over top of, say, a highlight on her face, you can see I got 254 reds, 227, and 216. So try to remember those numbers, 254, 227, and 216. Then go over highlight on her arm. I got 255, 221, and 202. So there's a little less green and a little less blue in the highlights on her arm. Okay? So if I change my channels on this color level, okay, to green and blue, I can affect the greens and the blues. Okay, so let's go to greens, and whenever I'm working in the highlights, I can add a little bit of green to the highlights by pulling this white slider left. Okay, and I can pull the mid-tones to the left to add a little green, to the right to remove a little green. Okay, and then if I pull the blacks to the right, it's going to add magenta or remove green, because green and magenta are opposites. And same thing with these output levels. If I pull the blacks, what looks like the blacks, if I pull this to the right, you can see in the shadows it's adding green. If I pull the whites to the left, it's removing green from the highlights. Okay, but I want to add a little bit of green to the highlights, so I'm going to add a little bit there. And then I'm going to go to my blue channel, because remember I said my blues were low. So let's go add a little bit of blue to the highlights. And I want to add a little bit of blue to the midtones. So just by playing with those colors a little bit, you can see her arms now look a lot more like her face. So if I shut those off, turn those on, okay? And you can continue to hover around and pick, say, well, let's go to a midtone. Well, our midtones are 251, 185, 152, and then look over here, 251, 185, 182. So the blues are a little low, inner midtones, and you can recheck them doing this. The other thing you can do is you can physically drop points. Use this color sampler tool, and say I want to pick like a midtone here and a midtone here. So now you can see I got 224, 174, 140, and those are fairly close. My reds are a little bit high in my midtones, so what I can do is I can go to my red channel. Okay, and remember, if I drag left, it adds red. If I drag right, it removes red. Okay, so let's drag to the right a little bit, and we can get a removal of some red, and that's fairly close. I'd be careful doing this because you can drive yourself crazy trying to match the colors. But now, with those done, what I've got is I can shut off. Okay, let me clear these points. Clear all here, and if I look at the before and the after, you can see it makes a huge difference. Her skin actually looks like her arms aren't from a different person. Now, the other thing you can do is, I always tend to overdo this, is I'll go up to the opacity and just tone this down a bit, you know, because it's kind of natural for your face to be a little brighter than your arms. So I don't think it looks too off if they're a little bit different color. But this way, it's not dramatically different. Okay, and it looks very natural, and it seems to fit. So that's how you can do modifying luminosity with levels and modifying color with the color channels inside of a color blend mode on a level adjustment layer.